Hello everyone, so good to see you! I want to start this off by asking you to do something real quick. I want you to think about one or two of your favorite logos, and it doesn't have to be about games. It can be about movies, a show, a company, a food, any kind of branding. And then consider, is this the most recent version of this logo? Has it changed before or since? And did you find it more attractive beforehand, or does it look better now? I ask because it's very important to establish a visual identity with any kind of brand. It needs to be visually striking and recognizable from any place, whether you're driving down the highway, shopping online, or walking down any store aisle. Typical brands rely heavily on the iconography itself and commonly prioritize shape and color before typography. There are some that have just endured and become instantly recognizable, like the Nike Swish or the McDonald's Arch, to ones that literally are the brand name, like Target being a Target or Apple being an Apple. Obviously not all brands fit into this mold, and some predominantly do rely on text itself, but for as common as they are, you likely didn't think of these first before the ones with more color and shape, right? Some logos rely on one or two colors to convey the initial feeling or impression that they want you to associate with it. Others are very intentionally multicolored to impart a feeling of diversity and inclusiveness. Those can arguably be the most difficult to design competently without having everything clash, but each brand here does follow a messaging of a wholeness in one way or another. All of this is especially true for the entertainment industry. When you see a logo, the goal for it is to convey a certain feeling for the property. Considering the medium, games have much more room to present themselves with the use of animation to help set the intended tone or mood. Is it lighthearted and expressive? Modern? Fantasy? Or darker and more serious? But there's been a bit of a trend, let's say, of logos becoming less detailed over the years. Most of the branding that I've shown hasn't changed all that much, but as time goes on, more and more companies have been opting to incorporate a much more minimal and simplified direction. We have slowly entered an era where rather than having boisterous designs with colors, shapes, and angles, instead we're seeing a common trend of serialization. Logos have become more single-tone, and rather than having them jut out with bevels and embossing, they become flattened like a steamroller ran right through them. It's become very divisive over the years. Some appreciate the clean, simplistic, and easily readable look. Others think it robs the logo of personality and looks far too plain. And opinions vary from logo to logo. Some I think it works well with. Others, not so much. Companies themselves have felt the same way, as logos have on occasion backtracked to a previous design, sometimes several iterations back. I felt like the video game industry was largely immune to the serialization of logos. And in some cases, yes, they are. There are some, like Pokemon, who have by and large stayed exactly the same throughout their entire lifetime as a brand. Or have they? More on that later. To be honest, there's only one reason why this video even exists right now. The lovely leafy and floral Pikmin logo not only got hit with the minimalist hammer, but also went back in time and retroactively changed the branding. And in case you weren't aware, the box art for Pikmin 3 is going to change to represent the new style of logo, meaning that regions are going to have two separate prints now. And the very first Pikmin game is now going to be officially known as Pikmin 1, alongside the new design. Not long after the recent Nintendo Direct, there was an update for Pikmin 3, which all it did was change my logo. Oh, I kinda hate it. We have lost the fun, playful design of the original logo because of this. Look, the entire intent of the logo is that it's quite literally made up of Pikmin, but now it's just the number that represents this. Sure, the P has a flower in it, but it doesn't really feel like it's a Pikmin in there anymore. The number of the title usually represents the Pikmin that are newly introduced, at least. White flowers for the red, blue, and yellow in Pikmin 1, of course, and pink flowers for the white and purple introduced with Pikmin 2. 3, however, does not follow this trend. And what makes me more mad is that it almost did. An early version of the logo exists and has the 3 in the wonderful lavender flowers that the flying and rock Pikmin represent. Why did they go with red? At least Pikmin 4 returns to the trend and has yellow flowers for the ice and glow Pikmin. I understand that, like with character design, logos should have a recognizable silhouette, which doesn't really work out for the earlier titles. But it wasn't very elegantly done across all titles either. Pikmin is boldly in white and you can see it from a distance. But with 3, since they changed it, they couldn't really adapt to the fact that the logo and background are both green, so they put an outer glow around it. It's still not as easily legible anymore. There's a loss in personality with this one in particular. It's important to distinguish the name of a series with the first title of a game, sure, but I don't think every earlier title needed to fall victim to this generalization. It is a bit nice to see all the logos match, but less so when one of them got shoehorned with a background that it wasn't intended for. We can thank Pikmin Bloom for adapting this logo in the first place. The mobile game has affected the very first title in an official capacity. Go figure. Oh, and Hey Pikmin is here too. The logo isn't anything unique or noteworthy, but it is important to realize that since this game is a departure from the usual gameplay, the style of the logo was changed to reflect this. You'll see this as a common trend across other logos shown here, but we won't really be seeing anything like what happened with Pikmin 1 elsewhere. Seriously, I've looked up a great many logos, and I cannot think of another situation where Nintendo has gone back to rebrand a title like this before. This is kind of unprecedented. But let's turn away from Pikmin for the moment and look at some titles with a bit more legacy to them. Games that have had many titles, and thus variations in their logos throughout the years. The Legend of Zelda has been fairly static in their overall logo design, but there have been some notable moments in its history. Since the beginning of time, Zelda has been in red text. The very first title for the NES had quite a different look than what we're used to. What's peculiar, and you'll see this more throughout this video, is that the box art design for a logo might be completely different compared to the title screen of said game. This is an interesting decision in an area where you think brand consistency would be very important for games that you want to establish an identity for. But back then, it was just a different development environment. It's my belief that in some situations, the artists for promotional art, box art, etc. were different from the sprite artists who made the assets in the game itself. Because there might not have always been direct communication, it's possible that artists were left to design based just on what they had already seen or known about the game. Of course, this is partially speculation. None of us were there at the time, so there's no completely certain way to tell. You'll notice a pattern of many IPs using a logo or style, then adapting a new refined look that they have either kept since then or changed very minimally. A Link to the Past was the first time we got the iconic red font that we would become accustomed to for the majority of Zelda titles. Interestingly, for the next title, Link's Awakening, the logo did not change whatsoever. I think they wanted to establish the Sword and Shield as the defining icons for the Zelda series, going so far as to only change the subtitle. And that continued into Ocarina of Time, which introduced a much more iconic Hylian Shield and Master Sword this time. Going forward in time, see what I did there? Link's Awakening DX and A Link to the Past for the GBA both reused the same iconography as the originals, making this generic pair of a sword and shield the most consistent symbolism throughout the history of Zelda titles. Majora's Mask then kinda blew it all up. The logo went purple, the sword and shield turned into a mask, it broke all kinds of conventions. There have been plenty of variations in the logos over the years, like Oracle of Ages being blue, symbolizing Nehru, and the fact that Oracle of Seasons is already red for Din. If the fabled third Oracle game had ever happened, you can bet it was going to be green. That honor, however, went to the Four Swords titles, both Four Swords Adventures and the Anniversary Edition, specifically for the 3DS. The original Four Swords that came with A Link to the Past was actually not green. The logo was changed to have more consistency between these games. A lot of people don't know this because Four Swords for the 3DS was removed years before the eShop went down. A lot of logos have unique connections that somewhat ties them together. Many of the handheld games like Oracle's, Minish Cap, and the DS games all have an outline around the logo, whether they're bright highlights or a solid black. Just a little thing to note. Also, shout out to Link's crossbow training. This is probably the last time we'll see Link's name anywhere near Zelda's official font in the title. But at last, we come to the game that really changes it up. Breath of the Wild. Now, I can't talk about this game without bringing up Tears of the Kingdom. If you look at these logos, the style of Zelda's font has transformed. We no longer have the bold, thick, beveled font that we've grown up with anymore. What's more, this font is cracked, almost decaying, lending itself to more of an ancient feel. And this makes sense, right? Hyrule in these games is healing from a literal calamity. It is a massive, vast expanse that you can spend days exploring, and the minimalism can be interpreted in other ways, like how music is used, for example. It is a logo designed specifically for these games. Except it's not. That's right, don't forget about the Zelda game that came out between these two. Link's Awakening for the Switch refreshed the logo, but instead of using the sword and shield again, it used the same style logo as Breath of the Wild. It has the same exact flatness, the cracks in the lettering, everything, despite the fact that it has a completely different setting that doesn't even have anything to do with Hyrule. So no matter what direction the Zelda series goes after this, we are probably going to get used to seeing this style of logo from here on. Remains to be seen. There's a lot of subtle changes that can happen to a logo design without us even realizing it, sometimes not until very much later. Kirby is also an example of this. When you think of Kirby's logo, you probably have this in mind. As you might expect, the very first Kirby game, Kirby's Dream Land, looks very different to that. How many games do you think that this style lasted for? You might think that this plain looking text lasted for a couple of games or so, but no! This Kirby logo persevered through a sizable amount of Kirby games. I could have sworn that my baby boy Kirby 64 didn't use this style, but it does. Tilt and Tumble was the last game to use this logo until adapting the new one that I showed earlier. And guess where it made its first debut? Believe it or not, Kirby has been adapting the logo made for the anime for about 20 years now. In fact, the next official release in the series, Nightmare in Dreamland, used the exact same graphic as the anime, changing only the subtitle. You think I wouldn't notice, Kirby? But the logos more than make up for this quick job as we continue in the series. Kirby logos are very pleasant to look at, putting more effort into adopting a specific feel and style of the game, sometimes to a very tactile degree. Epic Yarn uses a fuzzy texture, while Rainbow Curse makes it very clay-like. Games that don't follow the usual Kirby formula stray from this trend, like Fighters and Clash, and instead do their own thing. I'm sending love to the little Kirby on the eye of Mass Attack. We all could use more little Kirbys in the logo themselves. So that's pretty much it for Kirby, right? No, it never is. Kirby and the Forgotten Land changed the logo. Can you tell? Aside from now being dominantly yellow instead of pink, which is clearly justice for Kirby, the logo basically just realigned the letters and gave them a bit more volume. Also, the star that used to rest in the B is no longer there, technically speaking, because it's now negative space, simplifying the look. And it's already been in more media than you think. It is front and center in Kirby's 30th anniversary, Kirby's Dream Buffet, and now in Kirby's Return to Dreamland Deluxe. Kirby's a sneaky boy. I honestly didn't notice some of these until later myself. I guess that's the sign of a good logo though, yeah? Distinct names like Zelda and Kirby, they allow for games to play around a bit with their branding. Metroid had some fun with this as well. As is the trend with plenty of other games, Metroid's box art logo looks different from the actual title screen. They did not become synchronized until Metroid 2, where the logo gained a slant that would be characteristic of many logos to come. But as far as actual designs, the logos for 2D Metroid games are largely their own thing. Metroid Fusion has a stylistic blue look to it, more smoother, wavy, and organic looking. This was probably for two reasons, one being that the look of Samus herself was smooth due to the nature and color of the Fusion suit, and also to stand out from the other Metroid game that released on the same day, Metroid Prime. These two released first in North America together before coming to other regions, pretty bold move on their part. The Prime series has its own format which it follows. While the first in the series has a pale golden color, all Prime games that follow give Metroid a metallic or chrome feel to the lettering. Even Metroid Prime Pinball didn't keep the gold. Side note, of the 3 Prime games, the first is the only logo to feature the bolt that looks like an S, commonly symbolizing the screw attack. Yet it is the only game in the trilogy to not have the screw attack as an ability in the game. Anyway, I'm curious to see how Metroid Prime 4's logo will change when it's fully revealed. If and when it is. Oh boy. Also notable, Zero Mission is a kind of creative blend between old and new, taking typographical cues from more modern logos and using the coloration of the original title screen. Meanwhile, Metroid Other M, being a game that decided to take a different direction in both storytelling and gameplay, also adjusted the logo. It still has that initial classic slant, but coloration and the use of a sans serif font gave it more of a unique identity and feel. Much like the game itself, there are things I like about it and some things that I don't. Compared to what we've had, it's almost a little too plain. But this, after long breaks between games, leads us to the modern day titles. Metroid Samus Returns would mark a new direction for the logo. For most of the titles in this series, Metroid has kept this all-caps serif font that has these same angular shapes inside the R's, O's, and D's. But this title for the 3DS calls back to the original game once again, and straightens it out instead of having a receding slant. This would further evolve into a minimalist design with the latest entry, Metroid Dread, where both the main and subtitles are one solid color. Given the kind of game that Metroid Dread is this better? Does this suit the atmosphere of the game the same way Fusions or Super Metroids do, for example? I'm honestly not too sure if I would have even preferred a style more textured like Samus Returns instead. What if I just... I'm not saying this is fixed, but maybe it feels a tiny bit more like the Metroid we remember. Although the series has a variety of different logos, it didn't take that long for it to find its overall identity, unlike some games which took quite a while to do so. A good example would be Fire Emblem. This is a bit of a unique case since the series has a number of titles that were released only in Japan, but let's go ahead and start with the first, which is, I have feelings about this logo. So here's the thing, this is hard to look at. I can't read Japanese, but I feel like it's still tricky to read at first glance. Putting Fire Emblem in English as the drop shadow, I can kinda see where they were going with the idea, but the execution just doesn't land as well as I think they hoped. What makes me laugh is that when this title got its limited release, the English adaptation of the logo did the same thing but just in the inverse. Here at least they did it in a way with stronger contrast and positioning that wasn't as hard to read. Back in the day this must have gotten a fair amount of criticism because the second title, Fire Emblem Gaiden, split the two apart entirely and was the birth of Fire Emblem. The third title, Mystery of the Emblem, which went back to focus on Marth, adopted a trend of having no idea what to do with the English name. We went from layered on top to evenly distributed side by side, treated like a small subtitle, and then with Genealogy of the Holy War, removed it entirely. The format of having a sword present had become a returning trend in these logos, at least until Thracia 776. For the first time, the English title took precedence over the Japanese characters, and there would be no sword featured. We would finally gain some consistency with the release of Fire Emblem The Binding Blade, as this went back to the format of Genealogy of the Holy War, down to the title coloration and positioning of the iconic blade of the particular game. And that's just the halfway point of this series finding a truly consistent identity. That journey would begin all over again with the very first Fire Emblem games localized for English-speaking audiences, being The Blazing Blade and Sacred Stones for the Game Boy Advance. These two would adopt the same style as the Binding Blade before it, but now translated in English. Finally, visible brand consistency! And it was very short-lived. The ninth entry, Path of Radiance, changed it up yet again, perhaps to identify that this series was now on a different platform, in 3D, and at a grander scale than ever before. We went back to the more regal look of a serif font this time. Quick note on the Japanese version, what happened here? Why is everything stretched to different sizes with awkward underlines that connect to the font? It looks so weird, but I do like that they incorporated the very important medallion that's integral to the plot, and they also went to use that in Radiant Dawn's logo. Aside from the embossing that looks like it took a couple of minutes to do in Photoshop, I like how organized and centered this logo looks. And it's still using the same typeface as Path of Radiance to indicate that this is a direct sequel to the previous title, which is not all that common in the Fire Emblem series. After this, we entered a brief era of remakes. We would finally see Marth's story with the localized release of Fire Emblem Shadow Dragon for the Nintendo DS, now with yet another redesign to the logo. I can only assume that this would have been used for the sequel to this title, New Mystery of the Emblem, if we'd only gotten it out here. The poor series was floundering at this point. For comparison's sake, while it did use these same bold, thicker characters for both, the colors used were entirely different. Also, the return of good old Fire Emblem. But thankfully, this was the final title that would deal with inconsistent branding, because with Fire Emblem Awakening, we finally achieved minimalism? No more bevel or depth in the logo, very solid and clean, with the tail extending from the F. Except for Europe. If you look closely, for some reason they use a different serif font for this instance. Why you do this, Europe? We can basically speed through the rest of the series because Fire Emblem has kept this style ever since, with the mainline series like Fates and Echoes to spin-offs like Warriors and Heroes. Three Houses temporarily had a placeholder logo in early trailers, but that got replaced later on. And here we are with Engage. Some people miss the quirky and unpredictability of the older titles, while others think today's is just too flat and plain. But I like where it sits now. I feel that it fits the series, and it's just nice to have that consistency. If you really want to talk about a logo that hasn't changed much, you don't have to go much further than Pokemon. It has been so consistent that we have to go way back in order to see any sort of change, to before it was even in the media the way that you or I can recall. If you want to go back to the beginning, this is what the very first logo for Pokemon was, back when it was simply called Capsule Monsters. The negative space brought out the very first imagery of a Pokeball in the logo. But even now, it's quite a lot harder to read. So in 1994, when the name got changed to Pocket Monsters, a new logo was eventually made. This continues the trend of depicting a Pokeball, inside the P this time, and now displaying a Pokemon that looks very close to Rhydon. It wasn't until 1998 that we got a much more iconic design, but even here there are a few differences. This specific style was only in use for mere months before we got the final design, which opened up the spaces in those letters, while stronger drop shadows helped to give more contrast. They have been essentially the same ever since, with the version name not even adapting their own unique colorations until Hard Gold and Soul Silver. I would end this here, but the best thing about this entire franchise is that in Japan, the logo has changed for pretty much every single iteration and generation since the first. I just find it so funny that a series so heavily anchored to their traditional ways is so open to changing the style of each and every logo. Look at them! If you're among the highest grossing franchises in the world, the name is powerful enough that a difference in logo isn't going to make it any less recognizable. It has become a household name and strong enough to carry itself through no matter what the subtitle is or what the design looks like. Partially because it's the Pokemon themselves like Pikachu that carry the identity more so than any other visual. The logo can do whatever it wants to. And they have their fun with these logos too. X and Y have the symbol for Mega Evolution, Sun and Moon the Z crystals, Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire, they have the blue and red orbs for the Primal Reversion. The Japanese logos didn't even adapt the traditional color scheme in a mainline game until Sword and Shield, and I think this looks way less interesting than all these other ones. Now I could talk about spin-offs, but I don't want to be here for 2 hours. There is one thing I want to bring up for the sake of its thematic differences though. You want to know the biggest change that Pokemon has made in their branding? It's the game with all the open areas and vistas. Pokemon Legends Arceus, Arceus, Arceus does not play like a traditional Pokemon game, but it was certainly advertised hard enough to make it seem like it was. It might just be a difference in color, but this is a huge change in comparison to other titles and spin-offs leading up to this point. I hope localized logos can be more flexible with their designs in the future, but I can honestly see it going either way. Pokemon really is just a fascinating franchise through and through. You want to talk about a series with legacy, outlasting even Pokemon and all other Nintendo franchises, it's Mario. We're mostly going to be talking about the mainline 2D and 3D Mario games because, it's a lot of wahoos to comb through. There were a lot of knee-jerk reactions when people saw that Super Mario Bros. Wonder has the same logo as New Super Mario Bros. Yes, it does have that look, but that's because it's just calling back to the original 2D Mario games. Like before, Super Mario Bros. Promotional art doesn't look the same as the box art as it does in-game, but at least these title screens retain consistency. It's actually Super Mario Bros. 3 that takes a weird turn. The box art is very nice and clean, and the title screen uses a font that seems very familiar to the ones seen today. This is the very brief era where 2D Mario games adapted this style with Super Mario World and Super Mario All-Stars. The box art for the aforementioned title is a beautiful compilation of all the different logos in one place. But it was Super Mario World in particular that introduced the colorful look that the 3D Mario games and Mario's branding as a whole would take and run with into the modern era. Super Mario 64 began the trend of separating the 2D side-scrolling Marios from the 3D titles, with very angular font in a variety of colors. Or at least it would have if Mario Sunshine didn't immediately break the trend by having the font colors dominantly be blue instead. Speaking of blue, when the release of Super Mario 64 DS came out, Nintendo changed the Super to be blue instead of multicolored. Wonder if they did that to make Mario's name stand out more. Mainline 3D Mario games would continue this trend by making the Super into one solid color, like with Super Mario Galaxy, Galaxy 2, and Mario Odyssey. There is a slight difference in the style guide by the time Odyssey released, however. Taking a brief look at Super Mario 3D Land and World, they both mostly follow the same trend with a similar logo and a tail sticking out of the D. But it wasn't until 3D Land that they started to make the M red. Took Nintendo a moment to think, oh wait, there's a recognizable red M on his hat, isn't there? We're more than likely to see that red M stay for good in the media, even outside of games from now on. Going back to the 2D games for a moment, there was this funny era where each title was getting remade for the Game Boy Advance, marked as the Super Mario Advance series. It kept the chunky font, but kept on changing the colors. Super Mario Advance 4 is a fascinating case, as when you boot it up, you see like 3 different identifying logos for the game. The original box art, this selection screen, and then the actual title itself. And it has such a strong legacy that it doesn't matter. Most people don't even question them or think twice. As mentioned before, the new Super Mario Bros. Series, after its long reign, eventually solidified this for the 2D Mario games going forward. I am clearly not the only one feeling some fatigue in this logo. Even new Super Luigi U was trying to delete the logo. Considering that the 2D Mario Bros. Logo style is more or less already that clean, single tone design, we can agree that the games have been immune to becoming too simplified, right? Well, funny thing about that, the Mario series has already had a case of this. Where? Super Mario Maker doesn't fall into any of the previous categories. Yes, by definition they are 2D Mario games, but nearly half of the core experience is making and experimenting with levels themselves. They are about the community, about being creative and sharing experiences with others, quite literally, so they needed to construct a new logo design to reflect this departure. You start with nothing, a plain canvas, and build it into something in your vision. I have no idea if that design philosophy is why Mario Maker went the minimalist route, but you know, after looking through all the others, man, this logo is plain. The most interesting part of it is the massive 2 in the sequel. But I know myself, if it says Mario in the title, I more than likely will be picking it up regardless. Mario is a big franchise. Just like with Pokemon, we would be here for a while going over all the side series and spin-offs. So let's talk about a much smaller series, one that encapsulates everything. Oh, I miss this logo. From humble beginnings. Interestingly enough, the most recognizable symbolism in Smash Bros. For the N64 is not the logo itself, but this symbol. This is designed to represent 4 players in a match of Smash, which I'm honestly not entirely convinced of that when all the pieces are different sizes, and it's unfortunately outdated since 8-player Smash exists, but that's beside the point. It's still a cool logo. All you have to see is this circle with a cross and people will immediately know what to associate with it. It's become such a powerful symbol. I love it for that, despite how arguably simple it is. Because simple doesn't always necessarily mean bland, you know? And it's so iconic that it would become the O in Brothers going forward for the rest of the series' identity. The logo has not changed very much at all since Melee, but when you get the Super Smash Bros. Ultimate, would you look at that? The coloration, textures, strokes, and intense contrasts have just been removed. Have you noticed that it's the Switch era that really started to simplify and change logos for some of Nintendo's most iconic series? Not that it's a bad thing, just that the trend has been constantly encroaching more and more on our beloved franchises. So to end this off, let's talk about a series that is less than beloved. I wish I didn't have to say it was about F-Zero. But tell me, when you think of F-Zero, which logo do you think of first? Is it the original one from the Super Nintendo? Is it the one from F-Zero GX? Is it this one? If you said it's this one, it's a lie. It's not this one, I made this up, and you played yourself. Well, whichever one you picked, it's not how Nintendo meant for the series to be identified with, because every single entry of F-Zero has an entirely different logo. There have been some similarities in typographical consistency, but their franchise unfortunately didn't live long enough to enter an era where it would have been given a more grounded identity. Overseas, F-Zero GX has been the most recognizable for being the last release out here. And I say that because in Japan, the final game to be released before its hiatus was F-Zero Climax for the Game Boy Advance. Aside from Maximum Velocity and GP Legend, this is the 3rd game on the handheld and the only one that we never got overseas. Which is a shame because Climax looks so good and stylish. Look at that sprite work. It also gave us this in the Japanese ad. God, I miss this series. But yes, in actuality, this logo references the style of F-Zero X most closely, which I think is what Nintendo wanted to lean towards the most. In Nintendo Land, Captain Falcon's Twister Race sports a logo that also closely resembles this style for X, so if we happen to ever get another F-Zero game, it might resemble this. But it's just as possible that it'll get flattened as per the trend. Or we'll get something completely new and different. I wish I knew what to expect, because right now, it's sad that I have to expect nothing. I just want the protagonist of Super Smash Bros. To get his own game again. There are so many logos that we can go through, especially when some Nintendo games have spin-offs of spin-offs at this point. But if there is one consistent factor across a lot of these, it's that many of them have had their iconic branding changed and simplified at this point, many of it happening within just the last 5 years. As a designer, I can start to see what they're going for. This minimalization has ensnared many brands and IPs in just the last decade alone. In some cases, we've gone from very detailed and characteristic of individual games to notably more bland and solid. Does it work out? In my opinion, not always. It's simply another trend in the entertainment industry, and one that artists and designers just have to adapt to. But what are your thoughts? What are some of your favorite logos in games, and are we getting too simple with some of these? Let us know in the comments, and consider subscribing to Good Vibes Gaming, leaving a like, ringing the bell, checking out our Twitch channel, and just for $1 on Patreon, you can join our wonderful Discord community, where you can tell us what we're doing right and what we can do better. In fact, let's check the improvements channel right now. Well, everything looks perfect here to me. Thank you all so much for watching. Till we meet again.